What if he wasn't pulling away out of disinterest, but out of fear that you truly see him? We've been taught that when a man pulls away after an intimate night, it's because he's already gotten what he wanted. But what if that's just the surface of a deeper, less spoken truth? Maybe, right after connecting with you, you touched a part of him he doesn't even know how to look at. An old wound, a buried emotion, a shadow he's avoiding facing. It's not rejection, it's avoidance. And not toward you, but toward what you just reflected back at him. They call him detached, mysterious, cold. They say he never fully gives himself away, that he seems to be there but isn't, that he can share a bed, a laugh, a life plan, and still not fully open the door to his soul. But no one asks why. No one stops to look beyond the judgment, to see the child behind the man. Because that man who seems reticent today was once a child full of emotions. And that child learned over time that feeling too much was dangerous. That showing vulnerability meant being hurt. That if he cried, he was mocked. If he spoke about his fears, he was silenced. If he asked for love, he was made to feel weak. From a very early age, the world taught him to disconnect from himself, to measure his emotions, to repress his tenderness, to not need anyone, and to turn self-sufficiency into a shield that would keep him safe from betrayal, abandonment, and pain. This is how he shaped his identity. A man who knows what he wants, who doesn't let his heart lead him, who dominates, who seduces, who conquers, but who doesn't allow himself to be conquered. Because opening up implies risk. Loving implies losing control, and he has sworn never to lose it again. That's why when a woman like you appears in his life, a woman who wants not just his body but also his soul, he feels dizzy, because you don't look at him from a place of need, but from a place of connection. You don't seduce him with lack, but with truth, and that's something he doesn't know how to handle. Because with you, he can't apply the learned script. With you, disappearing emotionally to maintain power doesn't work, because you don't play to win. You're willing to feel, but not him. He's learned to hide even in the midst of intimacy. He can look at you, touch you, sleep beside you, and still remain an impregnable fortress, because he's trained to do just that, to avoid being reached, to not be fully seen. And every time you manage to pierce through a layer, he panics, because he doesn't know what to do with what's beginning to rise inside him, and then he runs away. Not always physically. Sometimes he withdraws emotionally, becoming cold, distant, erratic, and you wonder, was it me? Did I say something? Did I expect too much? Did I overfeel? But no, it wasn't you. It was the mirror. And in you, he saw something he wasn't ready to face. His emptiness, his disconnection, his deep desire to be loved without knowing how to receive that love. Because the wound isn't in you. It's in the conditioning that shaped him, in the emotional upbringing he never received, in the years he was told that being a man meant being invulnerable. And so, he gradually lost access to his inner world. He became someone who deeply desires love, but doesn't know what to do when it's right in front of him. And you reveal that contradiction to him. That's why he pulls away. Not for lack of interest, but because being near you forces him to feel. And feeling is something he hasn't yet learned to sustain. Carl Jung once said that what is not made conscious manifests in our lives as destiny. And in love, that becomes a painfully accurate mirror. Because the man who distances himself from intimacy doesn't do so from coldness, but from an internal struggle that even he doesn't fully understand. And it's at that point that his inner journey begins. Although it's not always voluntary. Sometimes all it takes is a woman who truly looks at him, who doesn't want to change him, but rather to understand him, for something in his unconscious to begin to break. And that breaking hurts because it's not the breakup of a relationship. It's the breakup of the false self that has sustained him his entire life. At first, he tries to resist. He tells himself it was just a mistake, that he doesn't want anything serious, that he wasn't ready. But those justifications don't give him peace, because something from what he experienced with you resonated deeply within him. He may not know how to name it, but he feels it. He was seen. And to be seen without masks when you've lived in hiding for years is overwhelming. Then, inside, the shadow is activated. That part of you that you've denied, repressed, projected onto others. Jung defined the shadow as everything the ego rejects from itself, but that doesn't disappear. It just hides. And you, without seeking it, touched your shadow. You showed it your desire to be loved, unconditionally, but also your fear of not deserving it. You reflected your tenderness, but also your guilt, your shame, your unresolved need. Because true love doesn't just heal, it also reveals. And when you've spent years avoiding pain, being revealed can feel like a threat. That's why he blames you. He accuses you of being intense, of asking too much, of going too fast. But in reality, it's not you he's rejecting. It's the internal movement you provoked. Because if he accepted what he feels, he would also have to accept everything that hasn't healed. He would have to look at his wounded child, the teenager who didn't know how to endure abandonment, the young man who confused desire with courage, the man who learned to love from a distance so as not to be truly touched. And that journey is hard. It's not linear, it's not immediate, it's not comfortable. That's why many prefer to flee, to return to the familiar, to the emotional routine where no one demands authenticity, where one can be desired but not seen, where the body surrenders but the soul hides. However, something has already changed, because once the soul has been touched, it cannot completely go back to sleep. That seed remains planted. Perhaps it won't germinate now. Perhaps it will need time, breaks, silences, more mirrors. But the journey has already begun. And on that journey, little by little, he will begin to see that his coldness didn't protect him, but isolated him. That his self-sufficiency wasn't strength, but defense. That his withdrawal wasn't freedom, but fear. And maybe along the way, one day he'll be able to look at you, or at someone like you, and not run away. Not because he's learned to love you, but because he's finally learned to love himself. And then something subtle, yet profoundly transformative happens. She stops waiting. She stops looking at her phone for signs. She stops wondering what she did wrong, or when something that seemed so real broke. And in that act of letting go, not from resignation, but from awareness, true change begins. Because until then, she had been loving from a place of hope, from the longing to be chosen, to be enough, to be the exception to her patterns. But now, without words, she understands that she didn't come to be medicine for other people's wounds, nor to force awakenings that aren't hers. She stopped begging for love, and she began to inhabit herself, not from the armor, but from the roots. She began to remember that her worth isn't measured by the reaction of someone who doesn't yet know how to receive love. That it's not her job to chase after someone who runs away from themselves. That when a man walks away after touching her soul, he's not rejecting her. He's rejecting the work he should be doing inside himself. And that, even if it hurts, is no longer hers. It's no longer hers to bear. And so, she begins to walk differently. She no longer expects redemption, explanations, or comebacks. Now she walks with the certainty that her love was not a mistake, but a sacred offering. That her surrender was not naivete, but power. That her capacity for deep love is not weakness, but emotional mastery. Not everyone is ready for that. Not everyone has the internal structure to sustain it. But she does. She can sustain herself. And in that sustaining, she rebuilds herself. Not from trauma, but from integrity. She no longer wants relationships that keep her confused. She no longer interprets silence as mystery. She now recognizes that love that hides is not ready-made love, that the connection that needs to be pursued to stay alive is destined to exhaust her. And in that awakening, she chooses something radical, not to stay where she can't be fully herself. She no longer desires someone to choose her. She desires someone to be ready, because now she knows that her love is a revelation, not a transaction. And then she lets go of him, of her story, of the illusion that things could have been different if only. And in that letting go, she recovers. She reclaims her voice, her energy, her time, her dignity. She begins to inhabit spaces where she doesn't need to explain or diminish herself, where connection is mutual, commitment is free, and growth is shared. Because once a woman has seen herself after being broken, she can no longer unlearn. It's no longer negotiable. It's no longer abandoned. He left, yes, but she came back to herself, and that's worth more than any reunion. He didn't walk away because you were too much. He walked away because for an instant you were everything he'd been looking for, and that confronted him with everything he didn't know how to hold. You didn't scare him away with your intensity, you confronted him with his truth, because you didn't come to flatter his ego, but to touch his soul. And there's one thing the world doesn't teach men: how to deal with a woman who wants not just their presence, but their authenticity. You're not broken for having loved so much. He was broken by not knowing what to do with that. Because you didn't hide, you didn't play hard to get, you didn't feign indifference. You showed yourself completely, without filters. You told him with your gestures, with your gaze, with your dedication, "I'm here," without masks, without strategies, without fear of feeling. And that shook him. Because in a world that rewards evasion, meeting someone who isn't afraid of connection is like looking directly at the sun. Beautiful, but uncomfortable for someone who has lived in the shadows. He doesn't yet know how to love without losing control. He believes that loving means becoming weak, that giving one's soul means exposing oneself too much, that letting one's guard down means losing power. He doesn't understand, yet, that loving from the truth isn't submission, it's freedom. That when someone truly loves us, they don't chain us down, they set us free. But you're no longer here to teach that. You didn't come to educate a man who hasn't yet decided to mature emotionally. You came to be you in your entirety, and that's enough. And that's where the big revelation happens. You are not difficult. You are complete. And that, for many, remains incomprehensible. Because we live in a society that has grown accustomed to women who minimize themselves to be loved, who adapt so as not to inconvenience, who pretend to need less so as not to frighten. But not you. You decided to be everything. To be truth. To be depth. To be fire and calm. And when a woman like that shows up in the life of an unprepared man, he can't hold her, not because he doesn't love her, but because he doesn't know how to love himself yet. You didn't break it, you just lit it up, and that light was too much. Not because it shone with arrogance, but because it reached corners of his soul he preferred to keep dark. It's not your fault if his soul isn't yet ready to receive what you naturally give. You didn't suffocate him with your emotions. You showed him the pure air of real love, and he realized he'd been breathing smoke his whole life. That's why it's honorable to walk away, because staying would be giving up on you, diminishing yourself to make him feel comfortable, pretending you need less, that you feel less, that you dream less, and you can't do that anymore. You don't want to anymore, because once you've tasted what it's like to love without hiding, any relationship based on masks tastes like a lie. So you let it go, not with anger, but with gratitude. Because even though it didn't stay, it came to show you something. that you're ready for a love that isn't afraid to look you in the eye, that doesn't tremble before your truth, that doesn't flee when you touch it with your soul, a love that doesn't need to take refuge in excuses, but is sustained by presence. You weren't too much. He just wasn't ready. And you? How many times have you looked in the mirror wondering if feeling so much is a flaw? How many times have you lowered the volume of your voice, your desire, your love, just so you don't cause discomfort? You've been told you're intense, that you think too much, that you should relax, let yourself go, not take everything so seriously. But they don't understand that your intensity isn't a burden, it's your gift. That feeling deeply isn't a weakness, it's a sacred ability. You are not broken for longing for authentic connection. You are not less for wanting gazes that hold, hands that don't let go, words that don't flee. The problem is not you. The problem is a world that rewards indifference, that romanticizes the casual, that exalts the superficial, and distrusts reality. A world that has taught men to fear emotional intimacy, and women to believe they must hide their essence to be loved. But you are awakening. You feel it. You know it. You can no longer go back. You can no longer pretend that crumbs are enough for you. Your soul demands presence, demands truth, demands depth. And yes, that scares many. Because not everyone is ready to look within themselves and embrace what you've already learned to embrace. Your fears, your wounds, your lights, and your shadows. You've walked through the fire and returned with ashes in your hands, knowing that from there comes the new. You no longer look for someone to save you. You saved yourself. And now you won't settle for less than what you've already built within yourself. This isn't an easy path. Being yourself in a world that constantly pushes you to fragment yourself takes courage. It takes awareness. It takes self-love. But every time you choose your truth over the acceptance of others, you're reminding yourself that you have worth, that you don't need to chase anyone, that you're not here to convince someone to stay. You're here to recognize who truly has the emotional capacity to see you and stay. Maybe there are still moments when it hurts, when you wonder if someone will ever come who won't run away, who won't be scared, who won't need to lose you to understand what you were. But listen carefully, that someone will only be able to find you when you are so full of yourself that you are no longer willing to become half of yourself for anyone. Not because you're closed off, but because you finally learned to love yourself completely. You are the medicine that many do not know how to receive. You are the calm that destabilizes those who only know chaos. You are the truth in a world full of games, and that, even if it sometimes leaves you alone, also makes you free. So don't be silent. Don't hide. Don't dilute yourself. It remains a beacon, even if some prefer the darkness. It remains a river, even though others only know how to inhabit deserts. Because one day, without looking for it, someone will come without fear of the water, without fear of your light. And that day, you'll understand why it was worth it not to stop being you. If this touched something in you, if you felt that every word spoke with the voice you yourself silenced so many times, don't ignore it. This isn't just a video. It's a mirror, a whisper that reminds you of what you already knew but had forgotten between disappointments and goodbyes. You weren't the problem. You never were. You were only born with an awakened soul in a world that still sleeps. Maybe you haven't been told this before, that your way of loving is deep because your essence is, that your intensity is not excess, it is presence, that the love you give is not excessive, it is true, and he who couldn't hold you didn't reject you, he simply faced something he still can't hold within himself, and that's why you're here. Because you're remembering that you didn't come to be little, that you don't have to beg for what you naturally deserve, that you no longer need to wait for someone who can't even wait for themselves. And if this truth touched your soul, if it gave you a little peace or a little fire, share it with the woman who cries in silence, with the friend who still doubts her worth, with those who still believe that to be loved they have to turn off, because sometimes all we need to heal, it is knowing that we are not alone in this way of feeling. And this time, you can be that light for someone else. Your story matters, your love too, and your truth is sacred.